Okay. Excellent. In which case, I think we'll get going, if that's all right with you, Sam.
Yeah.
So, hi, I'm Lucy. I'm a PhD student. I'm going to chair today's CEN seminar, so welcome. And for this seminar, we're very lucky to have Professor Sam Wass speaking about his work on microdynamics and what this can tell us about the development of shared concentration between children and adults. Professor Sam Wass is a child psychologist and neuroscientist who specialises in child concentration and child stress, and runs the Baby Dev Lab at the University of East London. So just before I pass you over to Sam, I just want to remind everybody that you can pop any questions in the chat, and we'll have time for a couple of Q&As at the end of the talk. So I'll pass over to you, Sam.
So you prefer to keep them to the end, do you?
If you, but that's usually how we do. But if you're happy to take questions throughout, then that's absolutely fine as well.
Yeah, honestly, I prefer doing it that way. If it's okay, because I just hate having a question in my head and having to remember it to the end. So, guys, if anybody wants to, and I'll try and do a couple of moments where I stop and ask if I remember. But if anybody wants to just say something, do just feel free to turn on the mic and just say, "Excuse me, can you do that?" Because honestly, it's just nice when everyone else, people who've kind of floated off. It's nice if it gets a bit back and forth before we do talking. So don't be shy to do that. Really happy to answer questions as we go.
Thank you.
Okay, so let's go then. Yeah. Okay. Good. So hello, very nice to be back here. The Centre for Educational Neuroscience has been a big part of my intellectual journey back through my PhD at Birkbeck, probably about 12 years ago now, which was, I think, just about the time it's getting started. I think Michael was putting in some big applications. I remember that was when, yeah, about 12 years ago. So so really nice to be back. So I'm going to be talking mainly about some very, very fresh and not completely digested, honestly, data that we've been getting from some studies that we're running at the moment in our lab. So yeah, so we're quite busy. So we're about I think it's 14 or 15 kind of permanent members at the UEL Baby Dev Lab, and we do lots and lots of different projects, many of which are super relevant. Well, in fact, all of which are super relevant for educational neuroscience. But sadly, I don't have time to talk about anything like all of them today. The other kind of big thing, in addition to the work, the kind of naturalistic dual EEG work that I do, that I'm going to be talking about today, we also do a lot of work with home wearables, with kind of wearable kind of microphones, cameras, physiological monitors that we put on parents and children and educators in home settings. Gemma, who's doing a PhD in our group, was, I think, did a talk for you guys about some of this work, I think a couple of months ago, quite recently. So hopefully you'll remember some of that, looking specifically at indoor and outdoor learning and using these wearables to look at kind of fluctuations in kind of stress and attention and learning. I'm not going to be talking about that today, but if anyone's interested in hearing more, parent-child kind of synchrony, adult-child synchrony, and that type of thing, really happy to answer questions if anyone's got them. But today I'm going to be talking mainly about dual EEG work that we do. The data that I'm presenting the new data I'm presenting is mainly from a couple of papers that Emily Phillips has taken the lead on analysing, but I'm also going to be talking a little bit about work from Louise and Tom, and then the data that Emily's collected was contributed to by Ira and Megan. So let's get started. So the question really is kind of how and why do caregiver behaviours help to underpin the early development of concentration? So I'm going to be kind of setting this up as we go. Personally, my route into this comes from, is that people coming in, Lucy, that ding dong?
Yes, I think so. I'm not too sure how to remove it.
Ding dong it. You're on mute. I thought you weren't on mute, but anyway, we can cope with a bit of ding dongs.
Only the hosts can hear it.
Oh, is it? Okay, fine. Don't worry then. Okay, so personally, my route into thinking a lot, very carefully about kind of social influences on child attention comes from my kind of PhD, as I say, done at the CBCD, very much an active part of the Centre for Educational Neuroscience and the Developmental Neurocognition Lab. which was a lot about, what I would call conventional approaches to studying child attention. So this is pretty much everything that we know about the neuroscience, how the brain learns to subserve attention, which is paradigms where we put a child, on their own in front of a screen, and we flash stuff up on the screen, and we measure their brain activity while we do it. What we know about this, very coarsely thinks about attention as a product of an interaction between two factors. Kind of bottom-up attention. So this is aspects of the outside world that are trying to, suck our attention towards them based on their kind of what we call their low-level stimulus properties. So, if you're reading a newspaper website and you've got a moving advert in the periphery of your visual field, that's very exogenously salient. So that is kind of bottom-up attention. And then the other big driver of kind of attention in the traditional views is what we call top-down attention. So literally, top-down frontal cortex kind of sending kind of attention biasing signals to the rest of the brain. And that's the aspects of attention that are driven by the person attending. So that, as I say, is the conventional approach to studying attention. That was definitely the base work for my interest when I started it in 12 years ago. And I've certainly done lots and lots of work within that, traditional, eye tracker, screen-based heavy kind of paradigms for studying attention. Personally, for my PhD, I spent a lot of time with eye trackers and designing eye tracker training paradigms to target kind of experimentally assessed attention. So that's a child, on their own in front of an eye tracker. We're trying to train their attention that way. And basically, like, as I'm sure you guys have heard lots and lots of over the years at CEN, I've certainly done talks for CEN before talking about this. It's led to a lot of follow-on projects, some really initial kind of exciting findings, but really particularly one big project, the iStars project that we ran based at CBCD with babies doing this type of attention training with babies at risk of ADHD, really suggests, consistent with the cognitive training literature otherwise, that this approach to improving a child's attention just isn't very effective. So we can reliably get improvements at the specific tasks that are being trained, but even a lot of near transfer is very, very hard to show. And certainly any evidence for improving real world outcomes and that type of thing really it just is not showing. And it's been very, very, very well investigated now. Okay. So that was my own journey into thinking about this. And, I've talked, with my developmental cognitive neuro DNL lab meetings about, why is it, why has this come through, so much correlational evidence suggesting that it ought to work. And so why isn't it working? We really, I think, need some really, really fundamental theoretical rethinking of, you turned on your camera just to nod emphatically. That's what I like to see. Oh, thumbs up to you. Very nice. So yes, some really, really fundamental, rethinking, theoretical rethinking needs to be done from these kind of findings. For me, the direction that this has been taking me in is, and I've written a couple of articles on this recently with things like, studying the developing brain in real world contexts, moving from castles in the air to castles on the ground, and leaving the baby in the bathwater in neurodevelopmental research. Really, for me, I've been wanting to step back and say, okay, so this fundamental approach that I take, which everyone takes, which is I have a mental function which I'm interested in, and then I design, so that's a real world mental function. Yeah, it has to be by definition. But then rather than testing it in the real world, I design an experimental task that aims to mimic that mental function. And then I take my participants out of the real world into a very, very controlled artificial environment. I run the experiment in that artificial environment while measuring their brain function. Yeah. So this is basically what I do, which is what everyone does. Yeah. But that has a large number of really, really fundamental theoretical challenges with it. Yeah, the ways that we're measuring brain function that way are very, very different in a lot of really important ways from how we measure it in the real world. So I've been thinking, read those articles if you want to kind of talk, hear more about, what I think the problems are. But for me, I'm at the stage of, okay, this approach to, training attention, hasn't worked. So what can we do instead? Yeah. So that's what's got me interested personally in these types of kind of naturalistic paradigms where we're trying to just study cognitive functions embedded in, as ecologically valid settings as possible. We're not trying to abstract mental functions, build abstract experimental tasks that we think mimic those functions, but we're taking kind of a very different theoretical approach. And for my money, this is, this is going to be, a big area of future growth. I certainly hope so. Okay. So today I'm just going to be talking about some very simple paradigms, and I'm literally just going to be talking about these two paradigms. One are where we get parents to play across a tabletop with a series of toys, and while measuring their brain activity. They're not wearing caps in this photo, but they are in all the data that I presented. And then the solo play session is, as far as possible, identical, yeah, except that instead of playing with one set of toys across the table, they're playing with two identical sets of toys whilst divided by a barrier. Yeah. And we really try hard to keep this as similar as possible between the two settings, in terms of the mechanics of where they're going to be moving their eyes, that type of thing, except for this idea that, it's solo play in the same place versus joint play. And we know that, for example, children find it upsetting, obviously, not being able to see their parent. So we position the height of the barrier very carefully so that they can still see their parent. They just can't see the toys that each other's playing with. So we really try to kind of match it between the two. Okay. And the reason that we're interested in this is because that we know that from the point of view of brain function, there are lots of really important social influences on attention that just aren't very well understood. So, for example, this paper, which is now deservedly very well cited by Chen Yu and Linda Smith, found, for the first time, that when a parent pays attention to a particular object whilst they're engaged in shared activity with a child, the child's attention immediately increases. And they really do a lot of kind of analyses looking at that. And there's also evidence for kind of long-term influences, in the sense that children that do this more, parents where they do this more, the child is better at paying attention on their own later in development. So there's quite a lot of evidence for that. Yeah. But these types of kind of transient influences on, someone does something and that affects my concentration, we're really not very well understood yet from the point of view of, what's happening in the brain, how does it change things? So that's what we've been trying to, do some work on. Okay, so I've tried to use a teacher term here in the hope that there are some teachers in the audience. So one-on-one. So when I present this in schools, they talk about one-on-one. So that's, got a child who's struggling with concentration and you do a one-on-one. Okay. So one-on-ones improve attention. So just doing something, one adult, one child, improves attention short and long term. Why? So we're going to be testing 3 hypotheses for that. Yeah. So the first is that the hypothesis that was very directly proposed in this paper. Yeah. And I was a reviewer on this paper, and through kind of lots of rounds of reviews, I drove it to about 4 rounds of reviews because I was being a real pain. And I kept on complaining about this. You're assuming that, they look for longer, therefore it's more top-down attention. But can you be sure about that? Yeah. So and as you can tell, I don't like that hypothesis, which I put this sarcastic and magically in brackets there. The presence of a social partner immediately magically improves children's top-down control of attention. Okay. So that's one hypothesis, which, as I say, is what Chen and Linda have hypothesized. And then I'm going to be talking about hypothesis 2, which is that the reason that children pay attention better for longer in social settings is that social partners structure situations using bottom-up salience to make it easier to sustain attention. Yeah. So when I'm in a situation, a parent, when they're picking up something, will, pick up an object and move it around. Yeah. Which makes it more salient because it's moving. And that's why babies pay attention to it for longer, or children pay attention for it for longer. Okay. So if that's our hypothesis, then obviously the short-term effects are easy to explain, but the long-term effects, why is this good for children's attention over long periods, become harder to explain. Yeah. So we're going to be talking about that as we go. Okay. So this is basically bottom-up versus top-down. Yeah. So hypothesis 1 is that social influences improve top-down control. Hypothesis 2 is that they improve, bottom-up kind of attention capture. Yeah. And then hypothesis 3 is a quite different one, yeah, which is it's to do with the responsivity of a situation. So social partners are responsive, and responsiveness drives attention, yeah. So whereas hypothesis 1 and hypothesis 2 are about, that arrow goes the wrong way, influences of the adult on the child, yeah. hypothesis 3 is bidirectional. It's about the interrelationship between the child's behaviors and the adult's behaviors. Yeah. And just to anticipate where I'm going, I'm going to be, concluding that both hypothesis 2 and hypothesis 3 have got elements of strength in them, but we've got nothing to support hypothesis 1. Okay. So hypothesis 1 was actually, I'm going to be talking about a couple of papers that I actually did a few years ago now with some colleagues at Cambridge when I was based there. And these were really, really directly written because I was so annoyed about Chen and Linda's conclusions. They're great friends, and I work well with Chen, but I was really provoked by his conclusions from that paper. So I wrote a couple of papers just arguing against it. So I'm going to be talking about those to start with. Okay, so this is where we get into this idea of, I started off by saying, okay, our traditional ways of measuring concentration using a screen-based paradigm, certainly of training concentration using a screen-based paradigm, have turned out not to work very well. Yeah. So we don't want to use this, I build an experimental task that mimics a real world operation and then only think about that experimental task. We don't want to use that anymore. We don't like that approach. But then we get into really, really quite a hard question, which is, okay, so how can I tell from observing a child's behavior, yeah, anything about their concentration, anything useful about their concentration? Yeah. So for example, say I want to know how in control is a child of their eye movements during a one-on-one. Yeah. Are individual eye movements, or individual looks to and away from the objects that they're playing with, are they driven by bottom-up attention capture, for example, or top-down kind of endogenous voluntary control? Yeah. So it's quite a kind of easy question to express, but it's really quite a hard question to test. Okay. So in this paper, the first one, this was just looking at behaviors. Yeah. And one of the ways that we could look at it is what we call the autocorrelation of the looks. So how quickly do the looks change? So do I transition suddenly from an area where I'm, paying not very, very good attention? Do I transition rapidly from, paying very good attention to something to paying very bad attention? Or do I have smooth transitions? Yeah. So basically sample 1, so this is time going along the x-axis, is 20 minutes of looking behavior. And these are all the look durations in seconds. And basically sample 1, this child has done a 100-second long look, and then suddenly they have a few periods of very short looks, and then they're back to doing very long looks. Yeah. Whereas this child, they've had a whole period where they do really, really long looks to things, and then they go into a period of short looks. So that's one thing that we can tell. I don't think it's very conclusive either way. I'm going to be going on to some evidence that's more conclusive. But what we found was that looking behavior during joint play has more fast, unexpected transitions from attentive to inattentive. Yeah. So this was one thing that, to me, my gut meant, it felt like, when I'm not in control of my eye movements, I'm much more likely to flick and suddenly pay attention to something when I'm paying attention to it. Whereas when I'm in a situation where I'm completely in control, it feels like, when I'm under internal attention capture, then, it feels like I'm probably more likely to have more, either I'm interested in something, in which case I'm sustaining my attention to it from long periods of time, or I'm not, in which case I'm not looking at it. Yeah. But as I say, it's not very strong evidence. There's stronger evidence coming up. Really illustrative, though, this question, how in control is the child of their eye movements during a one-on-one, it is illustrative just of how hard it is. The fact that this quite indirect way is the only way we can really measure it based on behavior alone. It just illustrates it really is quite hard to measure cognitive functions in naturalistic settings. So that's something, to chat much more about at a, head scratching DNL session in future. Okay. Better evidence comes from the neural data. So that's what we present in this other paper, this PLOS biology paper. And basically here we've got the child gaze and the child EEG, and the adult gaze and the adult EEG. And the child gaze is coded at 50 frames per second, so quite a high time resolution, and the EEG is recorded at 500 hertz. And for these analysis, I'm just going to be presenting the relationship between infant attention and infant brain activity. Later, I'm going to be presenting some stuff that looks across the dyad at the relationship between child attention and adult brain activity. But for now, I'm just looking child attention to child brain. Okay. So what we did for this analysis, so as I say, we've got the EEG continuously recorded and the looking behavior continuously recorded. So what we did was we took the brain activity at a particular frequency, say 1 to 2 hertz in this schematic, and then we took the child's attention. So that's either a 1 if they're paying attention to the object, or a 0 if they're not. Yeah. And we just did a really simple cross correlation between the brain activity and the object look. So are they paying attention to the objects or not? Yeah. So for those of you who are not familiar with the cross correlation, basically the 0 lagged cross correlation is the the looking behavior to brain activity at that same moment in time. Yeah. So if I get a positive cross correlation, it says that brain activity at this frequency is higher during looking versus not looking. Yeah. So that's the 0 lagged cross correlation. So that's simultaneous in time. Yeah. But then what you do in a cross correlation is you shuffle one time series forwards in time relative to the other. Yeah. So basically -10 is the brain activity forward predicting the looking behavior. Yeah. And then if I shuffle it the other way to the other side of the thing, it's does the looking behavior forward predict the brain activity? So you can look at how the strength of the association between two variables varies in time. Yeah. So that's what a cross correlation is. So we did that one is separately for each participant, then we averaged it. Yeah. And then basically we had our plot here, and I'm going to be building up this plot as I go, but this is basically from brain pre-look to brain post-look, and then this is the EEG frequency. So having done this whole procedure for 1 to 2 hertz, we then draw this line onto the plot here. Yeah. We then repeat that 2 to 3 hertz, calculate the cross correlation, average it, and then add another line to that plot. Yeah. And basically we go frequency by frequency, and the final plot that we get looks something like this. Okay. So this is telling us something quite useful, which is that during solo play in 12-month-old Cambridge babies, Marty, who I see is on the call, is running some of these analyses with different populations, and it definitely does differ. And I do always caveat Cambridge babies because they're definitely not representative of the world's population of babies. But theta activity at 5 to 8 hertz shows a forwards predictive association with attention during solo play. Yeah, so I'm getting this forwards predictive relationship from the fact that this blob is slightly not centered on the 0 line. Yeah, so it's slightly before, which suggests things that the strongest relationship is the brain activity forward predicting whether they're going to look or not. Okay, so that's the same one for solo play. Yeah, but our real interest was to look at the relationship between the differences between solo play and joint play. Yeah, and remember, we had this hypothesis: is the child more in control of their eye movements during solo play or joint play? Yeah, Chen had said during joint play, well, Chen had correctly noted that during joint play, they're more attentive. They look for longer during joint play. And sorry. No, this is really annoying because I haven't got any water. No, I started to cough. I try and survive. Chen had noted that they look for longer during joint play. So had concluded from that, therefore, top-down control of attention is better during joint play. Yeah, and I was, interested in saying, well, I bet there's other reasons. You can't conclude that just from the fact that they look for longer. Yeah. So one of the ways that we look at it is their internal brain activity, is it more forwards predictive of their attention during solo play than joint play? Yeah. So we've shown that it is predictive during solo play, but it turns out that it's not predictive during joint play. So this was, what we'd predicted to find. So I was quite pleased to find this. So this is exactly the same plot for joint play compared to solo play. And then this is just the activity at theta. So that the area that our cluster-based permutation had shown was the area that was showing significant differences. And here you can see that during joint play, you really get this. It's very clear that it's the brain activity forward predicting the attention. Yeah, during solo play, whereas you just don't get that during joint play. Okay, so children's brain activity is less forwards predictive of their looking behavior during social play compared with solo play. Okay, so that was us aiming to rule out hypothesis number 1, which is the presence of a social partner immediately magically improves children's top-down control of attention. Okay, just now, has anyone got any burning questions that they want to ask now? It's probably normally when you've got 20 minutes in and no one's asking questions, people want to save them for the end. But does anyone want to turn on their mic and just say something for now? No? No? Okay, happy then. That's good. Okay, get some questions at the end. Okay, So we don't think that social partners immediately magically improve children's top-down control of attention. Okay, but we do know that children's attention is immediately affected, improved, so they pay attention to things for longer when they're doing activity together with a social partner. Okay, so why is that? Okay, so another hypothesis I'm just going to work up to. So at the Centre for Educational Neuroscience, if anyone hasn't seen this plot before, then there's something going seriously wrong, because this is probably the most important single figure in educational neuroscience that's come out of the field since it started. This is Gogte and Gide, some massively influential papers, basically showing that the brain doesn't all develop at the same rate. The frontal cortex develops slower than other parts of the brain, basically. Okay, so if we're looking at interactions, and we're looking at interactions, really, really early in development, yeah, and we know that children very early in development, they don't have much frontal, where they do have frontal cortex, and it is active under certain situations, but certainly kind of functionally, it's not, and structurally, this is what this graph's looking at, is not kind of as well developed as other parts of the brain. Okay, so one kind of common sense hypothesis is, does the parent act as the child's frontal cortex? Yeah, so what do we mean by this? So John Duncan at the CBU in Cambridge, who I'm a huge fan of his work, he wrote this paper and talking about this idea that one of the functions of the frontal cortex is to link together attentional episodes. Yeah, people with frontal cortex. Have I just died?
I think you're back. I think it's okay.
Yeah, normally it works if I switch on my thing. How much did you miss, Susie?
I don't think we missed.
Not much. Okay.
Yeah,
fine.
nothing.
Okay, good. So John Duncan's got this idea that basically the frontal cortex kind of links together kind of attentional episodes. So that's what he's specifically arguing in this neuron review. People with frontal cortex damage, they have problems, holding nesting goals in mind, etc., etc., etc. Emily Phillips, kind of as a coincidence, before she came to join my group, was working on some paper with Lynn Murray, who's a really, and Peter Cooper, who are some really, really fantastic child researchers, looking very, very specifically at this idea of kind of adults linking together kind of semantically defined attention episodes. I haven't got any data on it because Tom is literally 1 or 2 months into his PhD. I think he's here today. He's a big CEN attendee. He's going to be doing some research, which I can't remember if he's actually talked about, but basically looking at kind of semantically defined event structures in naturalistic parent-child play. Yeah, so you have like higher order structures like I'm cooking, and then lower order structures like, okay, I'm chopping the onions, I'm picking up the knife, and so on and so on. So you have these hierarchies of event structures. So this is definitely one thing that we can look at, the role that parents play in the transitions between event structures, and the role of that as a driver of attention. But as I say, I don't have anything to talk about that today. But the way I do want to think about this idea of is the parent effectively acting as the child's frontal cortex, which is why children pay attention for longer in social settings, is, and here we get into this idea of scaffolding, which I put into the title. Yeah. So is it that what parents do is they structure an interaction and they encourage the child to follow that structure? Yeah, and this is the idea of like scaffolding, in the sense that you build, a rigid exoskeleton, and then you build up kind of within it. So the parent is the rigid exoskeleton, and then the child, builds up on that eternal structure. Yeah. So for example, when I'm playing Lego with my 3-year-old son, Freddie, what it could be is that the reason that my presence improves his concentration is because I am effectively doing the task better and in a more attentively than he is. Yeah, so I'm, my eye gaze movements are doing what they're supposed to do when I'm, really paying really good attention to doing the Lego. Yeah, and Freddie just copies my movements and copies my attention patterns. Yeah, and in copying my attention patterns, that's how he learns to pay attention on his own. Yeah. So that's a perfectly, cogent hypothesis that we can test experimentally. Okay, so that's what I'm going to be talking about. And now we're getting onto the super fresh data. So this is looking at how much do adults lead during interactions. Okay, So we've got these kind of naturalistic parent-child interactions. So I'm now just looking at the joint play interactions where we just literally put toys on the table, put claps on the baby and the parent, and we say just play as you would naturally, while we're recording them from 3 cameras at a very high time resolution, and lots of other ways as well. And then it goes through this incredibly onerous process at the moment of being kind of manually coded at 50 frames per second for every time they move their attention from one object to another, as well as where they're moving their hands, and a lot of coding goes into their vocalizations and that type of thing. It really is a very kind of labor intensive process. But one of the things that we can look at is this idea of, is the adult leading the attention or is the child leading it at the really, really fine timescale movements? Yeah. So this is a paper that I'm going to be talking about. It's under revision at PNAS, but it's definitely not guaranteed to get accepted. So that's why I started putting emojis in my slides. It's very, very lowbrow. I'm sorry. But there's a fingers crossed emoji there because it's definitely not certain to get accepted. I just thought it'd be useful because there's a reasonably good chance it will. But basically to look at the difference between infant leader looks and infant follower looks. Okay, so here I've got 20 seconds of gaze data. Yeah, and in this instance, the child looks to object 2 just before the adult looks to object 2. Yeah, so this we're classifying as an infant-led look to object 2. Yeah. And here, this moment, the child looks to object 2 at a time when the adult is already looking to object 2. Yeah. So this we're talking as an infant follower object. Yeah. And basically, back to that example I gave of me doing the Lego with Freddie. Yeah. The idea is if I'm leading the attention, then I'm looking first at the objects and then he's literally just following my attention patterns. Yeah. And we also had a third category just because we didn't have a chance to avoid it, which is basically sometimes the child looks at the objects at a time when their parent isn't. Yeah. And it doesn't lead to mutual gaze. Yeah. So here the child has, synchronous gaze in the sense that both looking at the thing at the same time. Yeah. So here the child looks to an object, but the adult doesn't, and then the child looks away. Okay. So those are the 3 categories. Okay. So the first are how common are these different types of look. Yeah. So basically, so for the child, this is adult-led versus child-led looks. For the adult, it's the opposite way around because this is just partner versus leader. And we find that overall adult-led looks are more common in a child interaction. But one of the reasons that they're more common is that they don't last as long. I'm slightly confused by the fact that, oh, sorry, I've mislabeled these. Sorry, guys. Yeah, so in fact, the leader looks, sorry, I put that green thing here. It should be on the green thing here. So they should be on the green thing, the blue and the ones to non-mutual attention. So they're markedly less common. Yeah. But one of the reasons that they're less common is they last for longer. Yeah. So infant-led looks last longer than the adult-led looks. Yeah. And this is consistent with a lot of other findings suggesting that child-led attention episodes associate with better learning. Yeah. I'm not talking about learning at all in this talk. I'd love to be. Louise Goupil, who's just finished doing a postdoc with us, has run a dual EEG study looking very, very specifically at this question of do child-led looks associate with better learning. So she's doing the same type of paradigm in a word learning task, but sadly her data is not quite ready for sharing yet. But there's certainly lots of other evidence from people like Katerina Begas and Vicky Southgate suggesting that, consistent with lots of other evidence from the educational neuroscience literature, that, for example, in this study, it's just if you wait for a child to point at something before they present the verb label, they remember that verb label better. And you can see that the impact of their verb label on the brain is greater. Okay. So this idea that, infant-led attention episodes are longer lasting is consistent with the idea from other areas that infant-led attention episodes associate with better learning. Yeah. Okay. So one of the things that we look at in this paper with Emily is, okay, so is it that the child is organizedly, reorienting the adult's attention? Yeah. So for example, when they look to a new object, are they doing a vocalization to say, okay, look over here. Yeah. I'm trying to shift the attention. Yeah. And they don't. Yeah. And we also look at, do they look up to the adult to check where the adult is paying attention before they shift attention to a new object? And it turns out also that they don't, or yeah, we're pretty confident that they don't. Yeah. So we found no evidence that when children shift attention from one thing to another, that they're organizedly using ostensive cues before child-initiated attention. And we also looked at brain activity. So remember, we'd found that in solo play, certainly in Cambridge babies, their brain activity forward predicts their attention patterns. But on this data, we then looked at, does the same thing when I'm in joint play with an adult, does the same thing happen? And we found, can we tell whether it's a child-led attention episode from the fact that we get increased theta activity before a child-led attention episode? And this, we were surprised by this. Our prediction was that we would find increased theta activity before a child-led attention episode, but we didn't. So we can't predict based on child's brain activity when a child-initiated look takes place. Okay. So this led to our conclusion that these child-initiated looks seem to happen pretty much at random, but, and this is the big but, and this is the kind of most important but in this talk, but even if they happen at random, children are very sensitive to whether their child-initiated looks are responded to. So we do get a difference in brain activity during the time period after the look, when I've initiated something and an adult has copied me and shifted onto what I'm looking at. So this, we think, and this is the first time that we can measure this kind of difference in brain activity. But this, we think, is, may well be the reason why, for Chen Yu's findings, that adults joining a look extends the duration of that look. And because, when I initiate something and then someone responds to what I've initiated, even if I've initiated it seemingly at random, that seems to be something that babies are sensitive to, which then drives their attention patterns. So, and there's a lot of discussion, the discussion about that paper about why it is, but it's potentially, what we're arguing is it's potentially a real fundamental, mechanism through which joint attention develops. Babies shift at random, but are sensitive to when their shifts are responded to. Okay. So, this was if I had to express what the talk in a cartoon, it would be this, and this is some stuff that I'm going to go on to look about this idea of parental responsivity is really, really important. So this is kind of what I want to be the main takeaway message of this talk. How adults respond to children is really, really important as a driver of their attention during joint interactions. Okay, and this fits with kind of lots of other papers that we've been doing recently that I haven't got time to talk about. For example, looking at vocal behaviors from the home kind of sensor data. So we've done lots of stuff on parent-child vocal behaviors and how they drive interactions. And for example, one paper that I've just done the resubmission of, children's vocalizations are heavily dependent on their own levels of autonomic arousal. But parents' vocalizations aren't dependent on their own autonomic arousal, but they are dependent of the child's, independently of any, direct behavioral links, And there are lots and lots of other ways where we can see that the parents' behaviors are more contingent on the child than they are on the parent themselves, I'm going to be talking about some brain activity findings that relate to that later, But the last thing I wanted to talk about is another paper that Emily's doing. Writing up at the moment, hopefully just really close to submitting this, talking about how parents alter the microdynamics of their own behaviors, contingently on the child. So we're looking here specifically at this time window between the infant leads a look, and the adult following the look. So what happens in this time window immediately after an adult follows the look? So we're really, really looking at a really, really fine-grained timescale here. We're really down to the microdynamic level. So this is 5 seconds before the start of a joint attention episode to 5 seconds after. So in the first 5 seconds after the parent has joined the look. And what we get is that we get an increase in the rate of the parent juggling their attention very rapidly between the object and the child. So we think that this is, the adult trying to take in lots of information about what the child's interested in order to judge how to best, go on to drive their attention further. So at the start of a new attention episode, parents dynamically flick their gaze back and forth between the child and the object. But then the longer the attention episode goes on, the adults start to change their gaze behavior. So they actually start to look for longer and longer. So we get this, so they then gradually extend the length of their own looks the longer that the child looks. Okay, so we have this complicated pattern of how parents are dynamically shifting their gaze depending on different phases of child attention. Yeah, and actually maybe I should have put in, we have relationships between the child's theta activity and the parent's gaze behavior as well. But we also looked at the rate of change of vocal pitch. So for those of you who know much about child-directed speech, aka motherese, aka parentese, one of the things that we know is something that parents naturally do when they're talking to children is they modulate the rate of change of their vocal pitch, and that's higher in child-directed speech compared to adult-directed speech. But nobody's really looked before at the kind of the fine-grained timescale of how parents are doing that, over time. Yeah, so we do lots and lots of different analyses looking at the vocalizations in this sample. I'm just going to show you one which suggests that very similarly, when you look, really at a really fine-grained timescale, parents, as you get into a look, parents are increasing the rate of change of their vocal behaviors. And the more that they do it, the more that they go up and down in the pitch, the more attentive the child is. Yeah. So this is basically looking at this idea of motherese, but a very, very fine-grained timescale. And this is parents, changing their behaviors really, really at the sub-second scale, in order to help, get in and support these child attention episodes. Okay. So this is a paper that I wanted to talk about because I think it's really, really exciting. Really, nobody's looked at this, fine-grained timescale like this before, and I think there's some really, really interesting findings here. If we, the ultimate aim is obviously to try and build a model to kind of forward predict how to help a child's attention patterns, and this is really, really crucial information in that type of thing. Yeah. But then as I was putting together this talk yesterday, I thought, well, actually, this actually fits quite well with some stuff we published a few years ago now, which was, remember, I presented this slide earlier looking at the relationship between infant attention and infant brain activity. Yeah. But we also in the same paper put in some papers looking at the relationship between parent brain activity and child attention. Yeah. Using exactly the same method of cross correlations, running separate correlations, cross correlations bin by bin, and then looking at how they look. So basically, if you remember, so this is the infant's brain activity during solo play, so forward predicting its attention patterns. Yeah. And this is the infant's brain activity during joint play. So we're saying that the child's brain activity is less forward predictive of their attention during joint play. Yeah. And then this is what the adult looks like. So we've got a really nice blob. So this came out as significant in this blob, that the adult is, their brain activity is responding, again, at a really fine-grained time scale to the child's attention patterns. Yeah. And this blob, if you notice it, is slightly skewed the other way. So it's slightly past the time zero. Yeah. Suggesting that, this is a reactive change. So the child's attention shifts and then the parent's brain activity shifts in response. Yeah. So I just thought I'd put that in because I just thought it fitted quite nicely. Okay, so parent brain activity time locks to infant attention, just as in this brand new paper that we were working on, the really, really microdynamics of their behavior also time locked at different phases of the child's attention. Okay, so takeaway messages are 12-month-old children aren't very in control of their attention shifts during social interactions. Yeah. We've got evidence that they are during solo play, but not so much during joint play. But they are very sensitive to when their random attention shifts are responded to. Yeah, which, as I say, we think is, potentially quite a foundational mechanism in, how joint attention is established and maintained. Yeah. And then the last paper was about this idea that during social interaction, adults are really, really fine-grained timescale dynamically adapt and respond to children, really at the millisecond level scale. Okay. So in a lot of ways, this stuff that I've been talking about, it shouldn't actually be that much news to the Centre for Educational Neuroscience, because it's known quite well now that kind of old-fashioned modes of teaching, I'm 43 and I remember sitting in a class, and the teacher wrote something up on the blackboard and we all had to copy it down. But there has definitely been a shift in educational policy away from copying from the blackboard towards interactive learning. Yeah. And this is motivated, any teacher who says, I've got a friend who's been training to teach, and, or actually I had this, I was presenting to teachers and someone was moaning about this. And I said, no, there really is a lot of evidence that interactive learning is more effective. Yeah. And basically the stuff I've been showing is basically, very consistent with this, is just looking at the sub-second time scale. So a really, really fine-grained time scale, and it's looking at attention. So how long we maintain attention to an object, not at learning outcomes. So basically it is, a couple of more wrap-up points. So practically, speaking as someone who spends a lot of time, often very tired time, engaging in shared activity with their children, I personally find it really, really hard. Obviously, it's what I spend my days thinking about. So I'm super aware of it when I am, doing Lego with my kids or doing a puzzle with my 18-month-old daughter. But what you have to be doing is, what I always find myself doing is I end up moving my eyes as if I'm doing the Lego on my own. And I only really look to Freddie when he's not paying attention as he should be. And I'm like, oi, 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 you should be paying attention to this. But what you've got to do is, what you should be doing is exactly not that. You shouldn't just be looking at the Lego. You should constantly be looking at which piece in the Lego is he looking at. And then once he's looking at it, you should be following it and then picking it up and then, helping him to sustain his attention onto it for a long period of time. He is very, very sensitive to if you're responding to his gaze. Obviously this is something that how easy it is to do varies a lot on the physical position. I talk a lot to early years teachers about the importance of getting the physical position right in a one-on-one. One-on-ones are very driven by responsivity, how contingent your behaviors are on the kids. So things like the physical positions make a big difference. But personally, I find it really exhausting. I find it much easier just to sit and do the Lego on my own than I do to do this, like ultimately triadic. I'm not looking where I want to look, I'm looking where my child is looking, and I'm just following their gaze. So it's really, really tricky. The other thing is, what I wanted to say is it maps on quite nicely to some other work. This is back to work that wonderful Lynn Murray and Peter Cooper are doing. And we've actually run a little bit of this in one of our things about dialogic book sharing. So it's this idea that, conventional ways to share a book are, Jack and Ori, I sit and read the book and you children have to pay attention. But what this kind of intervention, that they run it in a lot of low and middle income countries, is it's teaching parents that, in fact, the way to share attention with a child is not you sit and read a book and they have to sit quiet and pay attention, but to be responsive to the child. So it's very similar to what I've been talking about. Your aim is to sit so that you can see where in the book the child is looking, so that you can follow their attention, and then you can aim to support and build on what they're interested in anyway in the book. Very, very different way of approaching the problem than reading a book in YouTube. And this, by the way, I meant to say earlier, all the evidence about why video-based training is less effective than live training. This is all absolutely foundational to it. So reading a book to kids on YouTube is nowhere near as effective as reading a book to them live, and it's simply because when you're reading it on YouTube, you can't respond second by second to what they're paying attention to. So really, all I've been saying is we've been looking at some of the underlying brain mechanisms, or some of the brain correlates, probably is a better word, of what people like Lynn Murray and Peter Cooper have already intuited, that this is a more effective way of sharing attention with children. Also, again, with Tom, he's involved in this with a wonderful Discover Children's Story Centre, which I can't recommend enough. We're very lucky at UEL, it's just down the road from us, but really people travel to it from a long way away, and they deserve to. We're just trying to set up some work looking at dialogic storytelling. So they do a lot of face-to-face storytelling, and we're setting up some projects looking at, is it how the storyteller is influenced by their audience that determines the effectiveness of storytelling. And it's this same idea of this kind of interactivity, this back and forth. Okay, so just to close on a couple of talking points. So I put in the title of this talk, why scaffolding is a bad metaphor. And then I actually thought as we go, or actually maybe, I think it was maybe Emily Phillips, or it might have been Marta, someone in our lab said, well, actually, is it a bad metaphor based on our findings? And actually, in the Vygotskian sense, not that I actually know that very much about Vygotsky, I'm sure a lot of people on this call know a lot more than I do, but actually maybe that's quite a good metaphor. So the reason I don't like the metaphor of scaffolding is it's the idea of building this rigid structure for the child to follow. Yeah, and that's just not consistent with the data. Yeah, like that doesn't associate with attentive children. Yeah, but what does associate with attentive children is, this plate, balancing a plate. So the plate starts to wobble that way, and then I move my hand to compensate. Yeah, and then the pile of plates starts to wobble that way, and I move my hand to things. Yeah, so, but in some sense, Vygotsky in scaffolding is quite like that. Yeah, the plate starts to move and I move. Yeah, but I'm always, positioning my learning kind of goals just beyond the reach of the child. I've frozen again.
I think
Am I back?
Yeah.
Okay. Do I need to? Right. Sorry.
No, I don't think we missed anything.
Oh, you didn't miss anything, but you have lost. You have nice. Got to see all my slides again. Oh no, wait. Sorry, guys. I've got to do that, and then I can do this. Yeah. Okay. So, so in that sense, this idea that I'm always positioning myself, I'm very responsive to my child, and I'm positioning stuff that's just out of their reach. Maybe, scaffolding is actually still quite a good metaphor, for what I've been saying. Yeah. And then talking point number 2, and I was going to do a whole section on this, but I actually think, I actually got it right, because I don't think we would have had enough time for it. So we do a lot of work on neural synchrony and physiological synchrony. So that, in most people's definition, is being in the same state at the same time. Yeah. And the talking point is, I think, so what we've been talking about so far are these types of time-lagged relationships. Yeah. So the child does something, then the adult follows. Yeah. So this is what we would call sequential synchrony, or Granger causality, or Granger prediction. Yeah. But what most people talk about synchrony is this. Yeah. A is in the same time scale as B. But I think, most of the findings out there, certainly most of the findings that we were included in this review, which was, I think, only last year, could actually be explained at the level of what looks like synchrony is in fact the dyads dynamically adapting to one another at a very, very fine-grained timescale. Yeah. If you want, there's some simulations that show that. Not that it's a point that necessarily needs simulations, but that there are quite a few more things to say about that. Like, quite a lot of people would disagree with that. Lots to say about that, but I'm not going to talk about that now, because, as I thought, I'm out of timing. Just to leave you with my main takeaways, 12-month-old children aren't very in control of their attention shifts during social interactions, but they are very sensitive to when their random attention shifts are responded to. During social interaction, adults dynamically adapt and respond to children at a really, really fine-grained sub-second scale. Okay, thank you very much to the people who did the analyses included in this, so primarily Emily, but lots of data collection from these people, to participants, and thank you for funders.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Sam. That's super, super interesting work. Does anybody have any questions for Sam?
Looks like James does.
Yeah, James.
Thank you. Yeah, I was so enthralled. I use EEG in my research and graduate student, and I'm a parent of also a 3-year-old, and so it's fascinating on so many levels. And I wanted to, I have 2 questions. One, I don't want you to answer. I mean, I want to know your answer, but I don't want to take the time. Is one, hands. What are people doing? What are the parents and the kids doing with their hands? So that's kind of an interesting question. You can answer if you want. The other thing I guess I thought is about the difficulty of pulling this off in real life group educational settings, because what we're talking about is how important it is to be responsive to micros, a second or two, maybe less than a second, dynamic change. And it just strikes me, do you have any data? What kind of experiment would you design to look at whether there's a decrement or a loss of motivation and engagement and attention when there isn't a responsiveness because of, let's say, a group setting where 3 people look this way and 8 people look this way, and so the teacher kind of focuses on the thing that maybe 8 people looked at, but what about those 3 kids who are looking at something different in the picture?
Yeah, teachers always get really annoyed when I present any of this stuff for that very exact reason. So just on the first question, just to start with, James, I'm going to dodge that. We do, as I said, we have been coding the hand movements, but we haven't had very much chance to look at them yet. Pierre, actually, who's on the call, who's a PhD, with us is one of the things he's going to be looking at for his PhD, the predictability of hand movements, as well as the role of hand movements in semantically defined things, which is what Tom's looking at. Chen Yu and Linda Smith have done a load of really important papers looking at the role of physical position in influencing children's attention, and basically the short answer is it's very predictive of like the mechanics of where you're looking and that type of thing. They're very interested in this idea of embodied attention, how you do that, but again that is quite specific actually to this kind of the tabletop settings that we're used to. The second question, it's all very well being responsive, but how do I do that with 30 children in the class at once is a question that I just don't have an answer to, and I wish I did. The kinds of comments that early years teachers tend to make is, yeah, but if I'm responding to one child, there are actually particular children that you would try not to respond to, because they're the ones, if you're responding to them, you're disrupting it from the point of view of everybody else. That's definitely something that I think, Tom, it's going to be really interesting to look at in this work with the Discover Centre. Like if we're looking at, adult child, where you're telling a story to 30 children at once. But I don't have any answers on that. Does anyone have any thoughts on that? It's a really interesting question. If anyone's got any things they want to add on that.
Well, if I can just, I think you made a great point, and I think I wonder if maybe a skilled teacher, I was about to type this in, helps motivate other children to want to see what the other, like using a certain amplification of a child's attention onto the stage of the classroom or whatever, as a sort of motivator that so there could be some useful ways to.
Yeah, no, that's a nice idea. Yeah, Taya's got her hand up, and I know that there are some questions in the chat which I haven't had a chance to read, Lucy. And it was, do you want to ask one as well, or you just turned on your thing just to? Right, should we let Taya go? Yeah.
Yeah, if you can do Taya then, or wasn't it? If there's time, I'll read out some stuff on the chat.
Okay, great.
Okay, so I'll try to be quick. So I was quite surprised by your conclusion that children's looks are random. The large literature on the role of information content, the driving children's looking, but also it seems to me that it contradicts your own finding. We had that beautiful theta blob that precedes children's looks in the child-directed child solo play, which to me was the evidence that in a situation which looks are more intrinsically driven, you have this like the child attention preceding or driving, where they will be looking. So yeah, is there a disconnection conclusion there?
So honestly, that was the bit that that's the bit that of the story that I'm not I'd say I'm probably the least confident of the stuff that I presented. But the really important point, Taylor, is that nice blob of the attention prediction thing. We only found that during solo play. So when we looked, so this is the exact same graphs during joint play. Yeah, so that means baby's brain activity is less predictive of their attention patterns during joint play than solo play. So that's,
yeah, but I was wondering whether then a follow-up and interesting analysis would be to see if this is driven by whether, which is what was this was your hypothesis, whether the look is intrinsically or extrinsically driven. So
yeah,
can you separate the looks by whether they are intrinsically driven or whether they follow the mom moving the object? Because this is your hypothesis, right? That the parents move the object, produce some bottom-up stimulation, which then orient attention, and that is a different kind of attention, which maybe is less useful. So if you were to analyze the looks based on whether they were bottom-up or not bottom-up driven, then maybe that's going to lead to a clear distinction in whether there's theta preceding.
Yeah, so I'm just putting in grant applications actually based at the cave at the CBCD, where you can control the environment. You'll be able to control very precisely what the child's visual environment is. And the idea of is literally to look by look, was there a measurable salience change that triggered this saccade or not? We can't look at that type of resolution. We're at kind of measures that still feel a bit indirect. But just to be clear, that the two, you still there?
Yes.
Yeah, you're just sitting still. Okay. So the two things that I thought were motivation for that conclusion were the fact that the brain activity doesn't predict attention during joint play, but also this finding that they don't organizedly use ostensive cues around attention shifts. Yeah, which I think is quite nice. This idea that they're not more likely to vocalize, they're not more likely to look up to the parent before they shift attention. Yeah, that and the fact that the brain activity isn't predicted. But you're absolutely right. there's a lot more to do. And as I say, that's the part of the story that I'm least confident about at the moment. And it, you know, like everything, it's probably, you know, some at random and some not at random, but yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah,
Thank
nice
you.
question. Iwaz, did you have one?
Yeah, mine should be quite quick. Very interesting talk overall, but I was wondering about, you were saying that the children were reacting quite sensitive to whether the adults were then following their gaze, but maybe I missed it, but what you were showing, I don't think you showed the difference between that when they were their gaze was followed by the adults versus when they were not followed by the adults. So in both cases where the child initiated.
Oh, I see. Yeah, yeah. So that's this blue one here.
But in terms of the EEG data.
I didn't, because a really annoying reason we didn't, because they were so short, we just didn't have enough data to run the analysis, because you had to do this analysis, you had to have 2000 milliseconds of data, and we just didn't have enough, so we couldn't put that in, which is a real pain. The problem is with that analysis is it's hard. Yeah, and this was the point that I was making when I was reviewing this Chen's paper, the current biology paper, which is they were basically saying when an adult joins a look, that extends the duration of the look. Yeah, but what I kept on making through 4 rounds of reviews was, yeah, but a look that would be shorter anyway, there's just less opportunity for the adult to join it. Yeah, so that was our worry with that comparison. So if a look is anyway going to be shorter, there's less chance that the adult will do it, and it's very, very hard for naturalistic data to make causal inferences like that. So basically,
Chen was arguing about that, you were saying that they were reacting quite differently if the adult was joining them versus, I thought, not joining them, but you don't really have that data.
No, what we've got is you're absolutely right, it was. I haven't actually presented this very much, and that's actually right. I didn't, yeah. So the difference is from the start of the joint attention episodes. Yeah, actually, this is a really, really good point. Sorry, yeah, I need to think about how I present this then. What the difference is, from the start of the joint attention episodes, you get different patterns of activity depending on whether it was a child initiated episode or an adult initiated episode. Yeah, which is actually, you're absolutely right, Russ. It's a really good point. It's a different point to the way I put it, which is they're sensitive to when their looks are responded to. Yeah, because to do that, you would need to have that third comparison, which, you know, we try to run obviously, but we just don't have enough data for, which is the looks where they look and the adult doesn't respond. Yeah, so what we've got, our findings are the differences between you know, if a child, you know, if attention episode was started by the child versus started by the adult. Yeah, and then joined by, yeah, really, really good point. Thanks. Okay, how can we go over? How do we do for time? Or
if you're happy to do another couple minutes, then
yeah, can I just check? I've got a 5 o'clock meeting. Can I just check who it's with?
Okay, yeah.
Sorry, I know it's fine. I'm sure it'll be fine, but do we just check? Oh, okay. It's with someone I don't know very well.
Yeah, we could if you're happy to I think if your email's on the thing, perhaps people could email you questions
yeah, my email is on the thing. Should we do maybe a couple more and then I'll just put up my email.
Okay, there's a very quick one from Cassia in the chat, and then I think Gary, I don't know where Gary, yeah, so Cassie was saying regarding logic reading and being responsive to where the children are looking, does the same apply to where parents continually lead children's attention across the page, i.e. read a bit, interrupt, point things out on a page?
Can I dodge that one? That's not a quick question. I need to think about that one.
Okay.
Can I will there be a way to keep the comments in the chat? Can I screenshot the chat? That's what I can do.
Yeah,
let me screenshot the chat. Okay, should we do one more live, and then I'll try and screenshot the chat and then answer everyone by email?
yes, that sounds great. There was Gary did have his hand up, I think.
Yeah, I don't know whether you've got time, Sam. I think I'm glad that you came back to scaffolding at the end, because I think your initial characterization was too rigid. I think, you know, in language development, scaffolding would be much more set up in the moment just to support the child, and then it's taken away and then another scaffold's put up. So much more in tune with what you were saying at the end there. And I think maybe Vygotsky and maybe Bruner's version of Vygotsky would help with that general, the thing that you're saying at the end, that over time parents are responding differentially to the child's lengthening of eye gaze. That's very much a scaffolding concept in my mind. It is, but for me, I'm trying to figure out where when you said that the adult is the frontal cortex for the child. I think that's really cool. That's a really cool idea. And do you see that as being something that you can actually measure?
I mean, so the two ways I think you can measure it are the one way that we did measure it, which is, does the adult lead the looking behavior? Yeah. So is it that the adult is just doing the task and they're doing it in a properly concentrated way, and the child is just copying their movements? Yeah. And there we didn't find evidence for that. I mean, we do find that, you know, a higher proportion of the looks in the interaction are initiated by the adult compared to the child, but we also find that the child-led episodes, when they happen, they last for longer. Yeah. And so that's our findings for that. But that's obviously not the only way to test that hypothesis. You know, is the parent, you know, acting as the child's frontal cortex? The other way is this, you know, are they linking at a more semantic level of analysis? You know, are they linking together one kind of episode with another? Yeah. And I think that's a really interesting hypothesis that Tom is going to be, well, I don't know, actually, Tom, I don't, not to make promises for you, but I think it's one of the things that Tom could look at in his thesis, because as I say, he's going to be looking at this semantic thing. So there's different, I mean, it's obviously a very metaphorical idea, and you can actually test it in lots of different ways, but.
So you could have the adult taking a lot of the load in terms of the semantic linking, and then gradually lessening, and then the child's taking more of that semantic load, you know, that sort of gradual shift over, which causes some sort of growth in the child's.
So we've got some Pierre and Lorraine and Marta, who are on the call today, they're all working on a project where we're looking at similar data but collecting it longitudinally. So that's definitely something I'm going to look at.
Thank you.
Listen, I'm going to have to dash if that's okay. But I've screenshotted the comments in the thing, so I'll just reply to everyone. Lucy, if I can't find anyone's email address, then I'll just drop you a note.
Yes, no problem at all. Thank you so much, Sam. It's brilliant talk. Thank you.
All right, well, thanks a lot, and really interesting questions, and really nice to see everyone again. So thanks a lot.
Thanks, everyone. For next week, we'll be having a presentation by Dr. Abby Russell from the University of Exeter, who was presenting her work on a school-based toolkit to support primary school teachers working with children with traits of ADHD. So that's next week, and I hope to see you all there. Brilliant. Thank you.